Hello, my name is Nerdbrain, or Eleison, depending on what game I'm playing, and I play Symmetra. A little too much. In this video, I want to do a deep dive on one of Symmetra's abilities, specifically her ultimate. Photon Barrier is a very divisive ability. Get it? Because it splits the map. It splits the map in half, so it's divisive. Okay, for real though, a lot of Symmetra players feel like her ultimate doesn't really fit into her kit as well as her other abilities. It doesn't hold the same iconic status as her teleporter, her turrets, or her massive damaging beam. There's been plenty of discussion over the years about the possibility of this ultimate being changed or replaced, but I mean, it's been like 6 years. This ultimate has outlived both Symmetra's past ultimate abilities, so it seems like it's gonna stick around. So, I'd like to go over tips, tricks, and techniques on how to best utilize the Photon Barrier. Photon Barrier costs 2,025 points of ultimate charge to use. Upon pressing the ultimate key, a targeting indicator will appear. The player can move their cursor to adjust the placement of the ultimate, just like the teleporter. Pressing the ultimate button again will also change the orientation of the ultimate to allow for easier precise placement. Upon deployment, a massive barrier will appear that spans the entire map. The barrier has 4,000 HP and will last for 12 seconds, or until destroyed by enemy fire. I was gonna include a little tidbit about how the barrier technically does have a size limit and doesn't cover the entire visual area of a map, but does always span the entire distance of the playable area. But can we talk about what the Overwatch Wiki says about this ult? 484 by 50 meters. It's very clearly not 50 meters thick, so I actually have no clue what the hell the Overwatch Wiki is talking about here. In the hero-specific settings for Symmetra, you can change the default orientation of the barrier from horizontal to vertical according to your preference. You can find this under Options, Controls, Change Hero, Symmetra, Hero and HUD, Advanced, Default Photon Barrier Rotation. While in the settings, you can also change the confirmation key to deploy the barrier if you would like. The most important thing I can possibly tell you about Photon Barrier is how not to use it. The most common mistake I see Symmetra players do with their ult is placing it parallel to a choke point. While building it in a door frame so it looks like it perfectly fits there is satisfying to look at, by God, it is such a waste of the ultimate. By placing a barrier in this way, all the enemy team has to do is hold W and they've completely negated your ultimate. Placing it parallel to the choke point can accomplish the purpose of holding that defensive line, but any change in position completely nullifies the ult. If the enemy pushes in, you don't have a barrier anymore. If your team pushes up, you don't have a barrier anymore. At no point in time should you ever place Photon Barrier parallel to a choke point. You should always angle the barrier at least slightly intersecting with the choke. For example, placing it at roughly a 45-degree angle with the choke on Eichenwald's first point causes 3 potential fight locations to be intersected by the barrier. A little bit further, and we can split the point in half while also still having the barrier present at the choke point. Keep in mind that doing this does not compromise the defensive capability of the barrier at all. If anything, it can improve it. At this choke, enemies are far more likely to be positioned to the defender's right. Having the barrier here still blocks them off completely and allows your team to push up to the left and still block the enemy's fire. This really is the most important golden rule for Symmetra's ultimate. Even if you don't do anything crazy with the barrier, simply remembering to never place the barrier perfectly parallel to a choke point will dramatically increase the value of your ult. The most involved use of the barrier is a method commonly referred to as shield dancing. Shield dancing involves repeatedly crossing over the plane of the barrier in response to the movement of enemies, their fire, and abilities. If an enemy stays on one side of the barrier, great! You stay on the other and melt them down. Mission accomplished. But even at the lowest of ranks, people aren't that dim and will try to move past the barrier to be able to hit you and your team. There really isn't an easily defined method to shield dancing, and a lot of the skill involved in doing it comes down to how well you can read your enemy's movement. The best piece of advice I can give is that your goal in using this technique is to always be on the opposite side of the barrier as your enemy. Oftentimes during a team fight, it's going to be impossible to be on the opposite side of the barrier relative to every single enemy player. When shield dancing, you primarily have to focus on enemies that are the biggest threat to you, or who are the ones that are currently focusing on attacking you. The best rhythm and speed of ducking back and forth over the barrier is determined on a case-by-case basis. Just remember that this is the best way to use the ultimate in close quarters combat. Keep it in mind and focus on when and how you do this, and over time you'll improve at your effectiveness at it. Even without thinking too hard about it, simply just crossing over the barrier repeatedly will block a large amount of shots from the enemy. Additionally, keep in mind that your barrier blocks healing from certain abilities. Ana's primary fire and grenade, Baptiste's secondary fire and regen burst, Ilyari's secondary fire and healing pylon, Juno's primary fire and pulsar torpedoes, Kiriko's primary fire and Suzu, Lifeweaver's primary fire, Lucio's crossfade, and Moira's primary fire. And, I mean, the orbs, kinda. They travel through it, but they can't heal beyond it. This is important because even against enemies that can damage you through the barrier, such as a Winston or a Reinhardt, shield dancing can still be effective to prevent them from being healed as they follow your movement in order to stay in range to attack you. Shield dancing in this scenario can be more effective than just staying on the opposite side of the barrier relative to the enemy healer, as this will force said healer to engage with the shield dance minigame instead of just moving over the barrier once. Photon Barrier is, in essence, a defensive ultimate. After all, its main function is to block enemy damage. However, you don't need to treat it as a standard defensive ult. Defensive ultimate is a term typically used to refer to ultimates used in response to other enemy ultimates and advances. For example, the big two would be Sound Barrier and Transcendence, since their immediate impact is enough to nullify most damaging enemy ultimates. Photon Barrier can be used in this way, but it doesn't have to be. Barrier can be very strong against the incoming damage from a Baptiste's Amplification Matrix or a Kiriko's Kitsune Rush, and oftentimes the best play is to use it specifically in response to both of them. But Photon Barrier can also be used as an instigator. Simply putting it up can be all you need to easily walk onto the capture point or push through the choke, and honestly this is what I use it most often for. Especially so on attack. So don't get stuck in the mindset of a Lucio or Zenyatta player of saving your ultimate specifically to respond to another enemy ult. Your ultimate is a lot more flexible than you'd think. Lastly, keep in mind that because your barrier covers the entire map, you can use the barrier vertically through the objective to help your team all the way from spawn. If you're walking back from spawn, listen for voice lines of enemy ultimates your barrier could protect your team from. Or look at the UI to see how many enemies and allies are currently fighting on the objective. If a major team fight is occurring, your barrier could turn the tide of battle without you even being there. As the sim player, you will likely be the one to actually utilize the barrier with shield dancing to gain value out of it during a team fight. So it can be best to save it for when you are actually participating in the fight. But this is good to keep in mind, especially as a last-ditch effort in overtime. Okay, it's time to commit Carcube plagiarism and do a sort of one photon barrier tip for every hero. I'm going to list off specific applications of the Photon Barrier in each or at least most individual hero matchup, as well as some counters to your ultimate to be aware of. But first, a disclaimer. When performing any hero-specific tech or response, make sure to still orient the barrier in an effective way. While blocking a specific ability, you still want to make sure that the barrier is intersecting with the objective or current line of scrimmage, so that the barrier will be useful for the full duration of the ultimate beyond just the initial block. Okay, this one's pretty simple. For D.Va, just place the wall to stop her nuke from killing you. But this isn't as cut and dry of a statement like it was for the original Photon Barrier back in 2017. Photon Barrier isn't a short cooldown, it's an ultimate. Most of the time you can save yourself and your teammates from the nuke with your teleporter just as easily as with your ultimate. Also, generally just try to wait until the bomb has landed or that you're sure of where it'll land before you wall so you don't accidentally whiff it. Against Doomfist, you can use your barrier to block the outer ring of Meteor Strike. Just like with D.Va, there's opportunity cost with this, since you can typically just as easily teleport out of it. Earth Shatter can be blocked with Photon Barrier, just like any other barrier ability. However, unlike other shields like Brigitte or Reinhardt's, once Photon Barrier is placed, it's completely stationary. Its status as an ultimate also makes the total number of casts much lower than most other barriers, which makes it somewhat unreliable at blocking Shatter. I wouldn't advise playing with the mindset of saving Photon Barrier for Shatter. Oftentimes it's better to just change your playstyle and be further away from Reinhardt when you think he has his ultimate. However, do assess 1. Your confidence in the ability to block the Shatter, and 2. Whether or not your team has any other method for blocking the ultimate. If you're playing a Reinhardt mirror, then the responsibility of handling the ultimate is probably going to fall on your Reinhardt rather than yourself. Say if you're playing Junker Queen or something into Reinhardt, then maybe you should try to handle it yourself since your tank isn't capable of doing so. Earthshatter has a cast time of 0.45 seconds. The Overwatch Wiki doesn't list a cast time for Photon Barrier, and I've been unable to find an exact number from a reliable source on the internet. But from my very rudimentary testing of using a stopwatch on my phone and trying to time how long it takes from me pressing left click to when the ult appears, the cast time for it is roughly 0.5-0.6 seconds. So, like, at best, the cast time of the barrier is identical or slightly longer than the cast time of Earthshatter. So, unlike a Reinhardt Brig or Sigma, you really don't have the luxury of listening for the audio cue to react with your own shield. In order to block the Shatter with the Photon Barrier, you're gonna need to be either really lucky, really smart, or have a good balance of both. Try to predict when Reinhardt will Shatter before needing to actually react to him using it. Pay attention to when a Reinhardt starts playing aggressively, pushing up further than expected, or not dropping his shield to use a Fire Strike for an extended period of time. These are all subtle changes in gameplay that most Reinhardt players unintentionally perform when they're looking to use their ultimate. Building your wall through a pile of Wrecking Ball's mines can be a way to quickly clear them out. Just be careful you don't blow up your teammates by doing this. Additionally, your barrier will block LOS of his adaptive shields, preventing him from gaining overhealth from nearby enemies beyond the barrier. Blocking Ashe's Bob is so simple, but so effective. If you and your team positions well, you can basically nullify her entire ultimate. You can block the outer explosion of Bastion's artillery blast just like Doomfist's Meteor Strike, though of course Teleporter or just holding W can be just as effective. Walling off Deadeye is not only easy, but incredibly effective. Only thing to keep in mind here is that walling him off sort of disables your ability to shield dance other enemies effectively if he chooses to hold the ult for the full duration. Kind of cheating here, but keep in mind that any other specific hero texts do apply to Echo when copying said heroes. Okay, for Hanzo, this is a really recent change. As of November 22nd, 2024, Hanzo's Dragon Strike now damages enemy deployables, meaning that the dragons will do a good chunk of damage to your barrier. It's not like you could block them before or anything, but just keep in mind that a Dragon Strike mid-fight will do a decent chunk to your barrier, making it more likely that the barrier will be destroyed by other enemies. So just be mindful of this and be prepared in the case that the barrier drops earlier than expected. Okay, I've genuinely never pulled this one off in my entire life, but if you're the baddest bitch alive, you can wall right as Tire explodes and block it. Granted, you can also just kill it with a single right click, but honestly, I'll Venmo $5 to the first person to reply with a clip of them doing this in a real game. Against Pharah, if you build your wall directly through her while she uses her ultimate, she will do a bunch of splash damage to herself and die. Even if you don't manage to get this iconic kill on her, the wall can easily block the damage from her ultimate. Her ult has some startup and her rockets have travel time, so you actually have a lot of leeway to block this. If she doesn't die mid-ult, this can do up to 3000 damage to your barrier, so it's likely to break early to enemy damage after doing so. Against Reaper, you can wall off Death Blossom, but the time to do so reactively is pretty short. If he's already on top of you, then you likely won't be able to do so. If you see him coming in to press Q, or if he uses it near its maximum range, it's much easier to wall off. If Soldier 76 uses his ult from the high ground, the wall will either block all of his damage or at least force him to reposition, enabling your team to eliminate him or waste the duration of his ult. Up close, pairing your barrier with some expertly done shield dancing can be a game changer. Sombra's EMP will destroy all barrier abilities. It doesn't just disable them or hack them like it does to other deployable objects, it actually does damage to them, breaking them instantly. Because of this, you will need to be very mindful of an enemy Sombra. But despite what you might think, Symmetra actually has the advantage here. When playing against an enemy Sombra, do not ult until she uses EMP. Sombras know they can completely shut down your ultimate with theirs and will often save EMP specifically for your barrier. If you refuse to use your ult before she does, then worst case scenario, neither of you use your ult all game. And that's honestly a net positive for your team. Symmetra's value mostly comes from her beam damage and turret kills, not her barrier. On the flip side, EMP is one of the strongest teamfight ultimates in the entire game. After Sombra realizes that you're not going to use your ult anytime soon, she'll likely give up this war of attrition and just go for an EMP. If you think Sombra will be going for an EMP, you can position yourself out of range or LOS of your team for a brief period of time, focusing on just poking with right clicks for a while. As soon as the EMP goes off, BAM! If you do get hit by the EMP, it's still not necessarily the end of the world, since your abilities are only locked out for 3 seconds. As soon as you can, build your wall. Unless, your entire team died in the past 3 seconds. Doing this correctly will allow your ultimate to be used without it being destroyed immediately, but more importantly, your barrier will be built at a very crucial moment. Right after being hit by an EMP, your team is incredibly vulnerable, but now they have a photon barrier to protect them. Your barrier should basically never get destroyed by an EMP. Just a little bit of mind games turns the tables completely in your favor and nullifies this supposed counter to your ultimate. Under certain rare circumstances, it can be okay to just send your ultimate before Sombra uses EMP. Obviously, if she was just eliminated, then you're free to use it. But other times, having the barrier up for literally just 2 or 3 seconds to block crucial enemy ultimates before she deletes it can be worth it. Most of the time, though, use the mind games. Against an enemy Symmetra, be cognizant of how your barrier can enable her. Your wall will let her build her beam to max charge, reload her ammo, and regen her shields from pretty much anywhere on the map. It will still block her damage dealt effectively, but make sure you don't let her ramp off of your barrier. If possible, try to focus down the enemy sim first, right after you use your ult. And if she isn't dead after your ult ends, be prepared to deal with a buffed up sim. Against Torb, you can stop him from spreading his goo as he would like to, since the barrier will block the projectiles from his ultimate. But the puddle will still form at the base of the barrier and spread beyond it. The goo will also deal massive damage to your ult, so it's possible that your barrier will end early, so be aware of that. Okay, so this tech used to be a thing with the old Photon barrier as well, and just like with Junkrat Tire, it was much easier to perform with that version of the ability. By building your barrier at the right time, you can stop a Tracer's Pulse Bomb from sticking to you or your teammates. Again, fuck it, I'll Venmo $5 to the first person to tag me in a clip of them doing this in a real game. Venture's ult travels in a similar way to Reinhardt's Shatter, but is much easier to block as they have more setup time, and even if you get hit by the first wave, you still have a lot of leeway to block the rest of their ult. Using your barrier as an initiation tool to get through a choke point and onto the objective can be very effective against Widowmaker. Doing so will typically negate her position's effectiveness entirely. You'll typically force her to move from her perch with the barrier, enabling easy follow-ups. Against Ilyari, your barrier can block the Captive Sun projectile, preventing it from debuffing your team. Even if you don't block it successfully, having your team debuffed by Captive Sun is a great time to have a barrier preventing damage from setting off the chain reaction, so ulting in response to her ult can be pretty effective. Against Lucio, your barrier will block line of sight of his speed boost and his healing, preventing him from having coverage over an entire objective. More importantly, you can also prevent the application of sound barrier with your ultimate as well. If you see him trying to apply it from a distance, you can build your wall to prevent it. If the enemy team is caught in a Graviton Surge, you can also barrier through the Grav to block him from applying the barrier to his team. Due to the enemies wiggling in the Grav, the effectiveness of this tech can vary. And just like with Lucio, your ultimate can block Zenyatta's Transcendence from healing allies on the other side of the barrier, preventing him from covering an entire objective. The barrier through the Grav technique can also stop him from healing his team in the Grav, basically a makeshift anti-nade. Just like with Sound Barrier, results may vary due to the wiggle. Despite a core part of Symmetra's identity and personality as a character being about order and precision, gameplay-wise she is historically the most janky and chaotic character in the entire game. In all three major iterations of the character, there have been bugs, glitches, and exploits plaguing the character that have literally never been fixed. Thankfully, Photon Barrier probably has the least issues out of any other part of her kit, but it has issues nonetheless. When targeting the barrier, the projection of it can get stuck on map geometry, preventing you from placing it where you actually want the damn thing to go. This mostly occurs when standing very close to walls or when looking straight up. This can be annoying and can result in a lost fight at inopportune times, but for the most part can be alleviated by simply looking down at the ground or at least lowering your crosshair a little bit when trying to place your ult. It isn't the most broken thing in the game, but it is important to be aware of as to not screw yourself over during an important fight. Good God, I managed to talk about literally one ability for over 15 minutes. I hope you found this information useful. Good luck in your games. And subscribe and all that, I guess. Whatever. Yahi param vas de victahe.